Welcome to this panel, Pulitzer's on the Road, which will be focused on two new prize-winning books, King, A Life, and His Name is George Floyd. As I was introduced, my name is Kelly Lytle Hernández, and I'm a professor of history at UCLA, and particularly African-American studies. Pulitzer on the Road is a new program for the Pulitzer Prizes. We are celebrating the winners and their work and trying to take it throughout the country and introduce audiences to our Pulitzer Prize-winning authors. This program includes live events like this, a podcast, and exhibitions. So please check out Pulitzer on the Road. Also, make sure to be on the lookout. We have a podcast, and the new series will begin in March of 2025. Okay, let us turn to our distinguished authors, our prize-winning authors today. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then we're going to launch into a conversation with them about their incredible books. So Jonathan Eig is a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He is the New York Times bestselling author of several books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Ken Burns calls you a master storyteller, and Eig's books have been listed among the best of the year by the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. He comes to us today from Chicago, where he lives with his wife and his children. Robert Samuels is a national political enterprise reporter for the Washington Post who focuses on the intersection of politics, policy, and people. He previously wrote stories about life in the district for the Post Social Issues team, and Samuels joined the Post in 2011 after spending nearly 5 years working at the Miami Herald. He is the co-author of His Name is George Floyd. So please join me in welcoming our two prize-winning authors today. Okay, so how we're going to run this panel today is I'm going to facilitate about 35, 40, 45 minutes. I don't know. I can't control myself with all my questions, right? Of conversation up here with the panelists. But then we're going to open up the floor and hear from you all. So start to get your questions ready, all right? And write them down so you don't forget them. Now, you two have written extraordinary books about two extraordinary men who have impacted the life of the world, if not just the country. I want to talk to you first about how you chose to write these stories. Jonathan, you've written a book about one of the world's most recognized historical figures as a freedom fighter, a leader of the Black freedom struggle in particular. What is it that you thought there was still to be asked and learned about King's life? What made you most excited? What questions made you most excited to take on this story? And similarly for you, Robert, you've written a book about a very ordinary man, right, whose name has been chanted around the world, but whose life was very little known outside of his family and his loved ones prior to his killing. What did you think that you could learn about by focusing on his life? And I want to take you back to those moments before you did the research, right? Before you wrote the book. What were you looking forward to? What were you curious about in taking on these projects?
You want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for coming. As you point out, King is a titanic figure. My friend Michael Eric Dyson calls him the greatest American, period. To take on King's life when so much has been written about him already can seem daunting. It did seem daunting, but it came about organically for me. I was having breakfast with Dick Gregory, interviewing him, as one does.
Pause there and tell the story.
I was interviewing him for my book about Muhammad Ali, and he started telling me stories about Martin Luther King. And I walked out of that breakfast, and I thought, wow, I should have asked him more about Martin Luther King. I was there to focus on Ali. And then I started thinking, there are still hundreds of people alive who knew Martin Luther King, because at that point, he would have been only in his late 80s. Today, he'd be 95. There are still hundreds of people alive who knew Martin Luther King. So it just occurred to me that a really good use of my time would be to travel around the country and interview everybody who knew Martin Luther King and record their stories. And I thought, well, maybe I could also write a book. And the thing that I think I had to ask myself is, do we need another King book? Because there have been some great ones already. In fact, I'm the third person to win a Pulitzer for a Martin Luther King book. David Garrow and Taylor Branch. So I think my advice to young writers is write a biography of Martin Luther King. You'll win a Pulitzer. The track record has been laid. But the thing is that it had been 40 years since the last biography and 25 years since the Taylor Branch and David Garrow books, which were not biographies. They're more encyclopedic in scope. And we had lost sight of his humanity. We've turned him into a monument and a national holiday and 1,000 streets. And in doing that, we've celebrated him as he should be celebrated, but we've forgotten that he suffered, that he had moments of doubt, that he had huge moments of failure, that in the last years of his life, he was deeply frustrated. We've forgotten how radical he was, how Christian he was. We just needed another look. And I think we need another look for every generation, because I've been writing this book as the protests over George Floyd's murder were taking place. So you're telling your story through a different lens with each telling.
That's really interesting. I started this project actually not wanting to write about George Floyd at all, and I'll tell you all why. It's a little embarrassing. But when those protests started, as a reporter of the Washington Post who had covered Ferguson and Newtown and other instances of tragedy, I know how heartbreaking they can be. I also know how dangerous it can be. There are gunshots that were sprayed behind me in Ferguson. I had been assaulted by police officers at a Trump rally. And so I sort of stayed away. That was my initial instinct. And then one Saturday, I started getting money from Venmo, from white people who I had known, but I didn't know particularly well, who essentially said, "I'm really sorry this happened. Go get yourself a cup of coffee." As if that were going to be able to solve racism in America or alleviate my great fear. And that's when I sort of understood that we had this really unique opportunity in this country to have a conversation about the impact of structural racism that I had never seen before in my lifetime. And so I started looking into that. And as I kept on reading about George Floyd, who by the end of the year would be the third most spoken name on the internet, behind Donald Trump and Joseph Biden, I realized, even though I was reading about him, I knew nothing about him. I knew some factoids, but I had no idea about what his soul, I had no idea about his motivations, and I had no idea about something that I had felt as I was growing up and getting bigger, about what it was like to live in his body. George Floyd was 6'6", 225 pounds. And when the Post first started talking about doing a project, that's what I continually told people who, by the time I knocked on their door, called their phone, they did not want to speak with another damn reporter about what they knew about this man or how they felt they watched him die. But when I explained that I had come to really understand the soul of George Floyd and to understand how the system impacted that soul, they thought, maybe this is something different. And that unleashed a really great opportunity to marry these two interests.
There's some similarities there in terms of a deep refresh to re-understand King and to understand for the first time George Floyd. When you talk about the soul of the man, I see it in your book, and I don't know if you all have it with you, but the very first line of your book is 3 words, often spoken by George Floyd, and those words are, "I love you."
Yeah.
The first lines of your book are that Martin Luther King, let me read it exactly. On December 5th, 1955, a young black man became one of America's founding fathers. Those are both extraordinary beginning points for a book. At what point, when you were doing the research, can you take us into that moment when you realized this is how I'm going to start the story, with the deep soul of this tender, tender man? I love you. with this framing of this incredible figure as a founding father of the United States. When and how did you know that those were your beginning points?
I've never been asked that question before. So the book was written with Toluse Olorunnipa, who's the White House bureau chief at the Washington Post, and we gathered all our interviews and we put them all in a Word document. And so most of the interviews, and we did more than 400 of them. Since this is an intimate crowd, I will tell you it was more like 600. Don't tell my publisher I said that. But we noticed something. And the first time I was speaking with one of his girlfriends, she had said to me, we were talking, and then we kissed, and he said, "I love you." And I thought to myself, good game, George Floyd. And then I talked to another girlfriend, and she said, and then he told me he loved me. And I thought, whoa, keep going. And then we realized, and Tola was realizing that no matter who he spoke with, like whether or not it was an intimate connection or a semi-intimate connection or a person who he worked with at the Salvation Army, there was a point in which George Floyd had said to the person, "I love you." And when a friend asked him about it, he simply said that people like him didn't have enough love in their lives. And so he felt like he needed to say it as often as he could. And Tola and I both had this thought of, here we are, this man who everyone got to know after he died. He had no control of his narrative. He's known for 3 words, which he never really had to say. And those words were, "I can't breathe." But if you had known George Floyd, the 3 words that you would know him for would be, "I love you." And we thought that if we were going to truly question, and if not question, give more gravitas to the largely vapid understanding of this man, there would be no better way to introduce readers to him as the way he introduced himself and his spirit to so many people.
Great. For me, if you think about that first sentence, there are 3 important facts. 26 years old, Black man, founding father. And I'll tackle them in reverse order. I wanted to address the fact that as a founding father, it's a provocative statement. I think he brings us closer than we've ever been as a nation to overcoming the original sin of slavery and making true the promises, the false promises that were contained in the founding documents that all men are created equal. And King brought us closer to achieving that truth than we've ever been as a nation. And if the Constitution is a living document, then he's a founding father. The other reason that I chose that as the first sentence, though, is that he's a 26-year-old Black man. He's 26 years old, living in a place where fear is being intentionally instilled in the Black community to keep them from daring to protest. And when he's asked to speak on that date, December 5th, 1955, to the community that has stayed off the buses in Montgomery for 1 day and is trying to decide if they can summon the strength to stay off the buses for another day and another day, they ask this 26-year-old preacher, and his initial reaction is, "I don't know. Let me think about it." He's a man. He's normal. He's afraid. He has doubts. But he also has faith in God and in democracy, and he stands up and decides he's going to do what he can to help this, and becomes not looking to become an activist. He's got his little church. He's got his 2-week-old baby at home. He does not want to get involved, but his faith compels him to get involved, and he makes that choice that day in the moment to stand up and to fight.
Oh, it was powerful. I want to come back to this theme about faith in a minute, because there is a thread through both of your books about faith and spirituality. But first, let's talk about the research process a little bit. You have incredibly difficult jobs ahead of you as you're beginning to write these projects. Everyone thinks they know Dr. King, right? And so you have to go out and figure out and find maybe new sources, new interpretations, and take us into that process, a research process, and how you were able to either identify new sources, access new sources, figure out what to do with those sources if they contradicted what was already in the public sphere about King. And you have a man who his public record might be most recorded in the police and court system, right? How is it that you tell a story beyond all of that that's more full and encompassing of who he was as a human being? How do you identify all those records?
Well, Robert and I are both newspaper guys, so we're very comfortable knocking on doors and calling people, cold calling them and asking them for interviews. And the first thing I did, recognizing that this is somebody who's been well documented, I knew I was going to be able to write about the marches. I knew that the newspapers had covered that. I knew there were lots of books that came before me. What needs to be done? What's the hole that I can fill? And one of those holes is to try to understand his humanity, to personalize him, to make a more intimate figure of this man that we've turned into a monument. And I can do that by asking his friends what he was really like. I asked Harry Belafonte, what was it like to be in the room? What did you guys do when you were bored? And Belafonte said, let me think about that. And it's always great. It's when people who've been interviewed a lot say that they have to think about it. You've asked a good question, because very often they can rattle off the answers that they've given hundreds of times over the years. And Belafonte said, I think we would listen to records, because Dr. King didn't want to go out to a restaurant. He wanted to be alone. He wanted some quiet time. He was very, he felt a lot of pressure in his life. He was exhausted. He just wanted to relax. So we'd take off our shoes and sit on the rug and listen to records. And I said, what records did you listen to? And he said, no one ever asked me that. Let me think about it. And he said, he tried jazz, but Dr. King wasn't into jazz. Martin, he calls him. Martin didn't really like jazz. So they started listening to songs of the movement, Leadbelly and Peter, Paul, and Mary. And Martin would sing along, he said. And I said, did he sing well? And he said, no, he sang loudly. So the interviews, to me, were essential. I asked his lawyer, Fred Gray, because the people who you get to know well, you're comfortable with, you can ask them the really weird questions. I said, what did he smell like? And he just laughed at me. He said, you can't ask me what Martin Luther King smelled like. But I said, yeah, think about it. Call me back. And he said, well, like Aramis cologne and cigarettes. So, it's fun to try to ask people the questions that they haven't heard before. But in addition to that, tons and tons of archival research. Thousands of new FBI documents had been released since the last wave of books. Some of them were just coming out in the last few years. As I was writing the book, every December 21st, another batch of papers were released because of an order by President Trump, my favorite act of the Trump administration. And there were other large collections of documents, archival stuff that nobody had discovered before because nobody had looked for a long time. So, for example, King had basically a private archivist, Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who followed him from Montgomery throughout his whole career and took notes on every meeting, wrote down every song that was being sung at every church. And his papers were at the Schomburg Center at Harlem. The boxes had never been opened. So that's the kind of stuff that we go crazy.
Yeah. It's weird. When I was at the Miami Herald, they had me cover the police department at nighttime for a time, and I hated every day of it. But it sort of taught me how to do two things. One is to deal with people when they're at a really tough point in their life. They're making a really strange, strong decision about whether or not they're going to let a person's name, image go, or whether they're going to engage with you. And also, it really taught me how to question what's in a police record. You'd get a record and it would say the murder happened at 155th Street. And then you'd go to the 155th Street, and then you'd go to 154th and realize they actually meant 123rd Street. So all of that helped in sort of attuning Tolu and me to thinking about how to tackle some of the sticker points of his life. But we also needed to know what we were looking for. And what we did not want to do was suppose that because of our nature, being a Black man, that we could have any true or innate sense of what was going on in George Floyd's life or his community. And so the first thing we did was we tried to speak with really smart people about things like housing and education and health and wealth loss. So we had a pretty basic understanding of that history. And then we started moving in. We started talking to people who had gone to school with him or had been on a bus with him or something like that. And then we moved in further to people who had known him really intimately. And that's when it really gets difficult. I'll tell 2 quick stories about this, if that's okay. The first one being that the first time that I had asked to speak with the siblings of George Floyd, their lawyer, Ben Crump, we all know who Ben Crump is. He's on television a lot. And I told him what we were doing, and he said, absolutely not. No way. You're not getting to talk with his family. And we were on a Zoom, and so I looked really sad. And I said, but why? And he says, I know that you guys have the best intentions, but the truth of the matter is you probably have a white editor who that when it comes to talking about George Floyd's criminal record, he's going to make it the most important thing in the story. And so, although I trust you, I don't fully trust that man. And if you get it wrong, Derek Chauvin, who had murdered George Floyd, will be acquitted, and it will be your fault because a white jury cannot understand the nuances of a black man. And we were going back and forth, and I said to him, well, if there's no hope, why even represent the family? Are we not on the same type of journey to dismantle systemic racism? Isn't that what everyone wants as an American? And Ben Crump rolled his eyes and said, fine. And so that's how we started talking to the family, and it turned out that they liked the questions I was asking because I asked them about their mom, and I asked them about the times they felt closest to their brother and what it was like to cook and all of that. And the second instance, when George Floyd was murdered, there were 2 people in the car with him. One's name was Shawanda Hill, and the other one's name was Maurice Hall. Maurice Hall, had pleaded the Fifth. He did not cooperate with investigators. And Shawanda Hill, who is a woman in the car, she did testify, but she was a pretty hostile witness. She was upset that she was called by the people who were trying to get Derek Chauvin acquitted, and she didn't really communicate. And I had this big question about why George Floyd was at that store that day. It wasn't in his neighborhood. The discussions that they were having in the community about why George Floyd there didn't quite make sense. And I just felt like we needed to know. And so I'm going around and I'm looking, and it turns out that I had a friend who had taken a picture of Shawanda Hill one day when she was outside of what is now known as George Floyd Square. And that friend was living in Chicago, and she had said, I called, and she works for a competing organization, so this was really dicey. And I said, could you help me get in touch with her? And she said, I don't really have a way to get to her, but I remember where she lives. So how about I come down to Minneapolis and we can drive and try to find the place together? This is why it's good to be nice to friends from college. And so we did that, and we get to this apartment building, and there are all these buttons outside. She says, I don't know the room number. And I don't know the apartment number. And I said, well, we'll wait for the door to open, and you can start at the bottom, and I can start at the top, and we'll just keep on knocking until we find her. Fortunately, I pulled the door open, and by some act of faith or complete lack of security, the door was open. And we walk in, and I hear a voice, and I still haven't seen this person, of a man who's clearly drunk, and he goes, who are you looking for? And I said, I'm looking for Shawanda. And he goes, Shawanda? You mean that woman who lives in... And then he gave the apartment number. And he didn't say woman, he said something worse. But then we went and we knocked on the door, and, I explained to her what I was doing, and She said, "You're really writing about Floyd?" And I said, "Yes, and we really want to make sure we're doing it the right way." And she said, "Well, if you're going to do it the right way, I have to be a part of it, right?" And she opened the door, and, tiny apartment that it was her and a bunch of liquor. And we sat down, and she started telling this story about things that we hadn't heard before, about not just George Floyd, the George Floyd that she had known, but what happened on that day. And so, there was a mix of fortitude and a mix of fortune that came in with a lot of these things.
I feel like I'm getting a master class in writing and storytelling and biography. One of the things that you both do as well is you don't just tell this individual's life. You give incredible family histories that are rooted in the structural racism of the early 20th century, late 19th century. How did you know that you needed to put these people within their family story that span, assume as far back as you could get it, right? Because most individual Black life is hard to reach beyond 1870 because of enslavement and issues around the census. But how did you know you needed to root them in their families and their family tale?
It was to Toluse, my co-author's credit, who had said, "I think we need to explain why George Floyd was born poor." And I didn't think much about it, but then when we started thinking about it, it was the only thing that either of us could think about. We were aided by a few things. One is that the history of the Stewart side of his family was pretty well recorded through family documents and family Bibles and things like that had been passed on. And this story about their great-great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart, George Floyd's great-great-grandfather, who was the first known person to have been emancipated on that line, was pretty well talked about in his family. That, by the time he was an adult with 22 children, God bless him, he had 500 acres of land, one of the wealthiest men in that part of North Carolina. Not Black men in North Carolina, top 2% of wealth. And what their family lore was, well, before he died, he lost all of it. It was all taken from him through all sorts of means, illegal means or illegal means, and papers he was forced to sign. And we know he didn't really know what was on the papers because he was not allowed to learn how to read, right? That's where the Floyd family story begins. When we started to continue the reporting and looking at newspaper clippings from the time and looking at the family who had owned George Floyd's family, what we found was a story that was even more horrifying than the family legacy itself. And you think about what that does, how that changes one person's mindset about what can be accomplished in America and what might happen to you if your family accomplishes it, right? It changes the trajectory of how we envision what the American dream and the American promise might be. And as we got on, Toluse became incredibly good with genealogy, but it was such a remarkable gift to really sort of understand the roots of what was a true fare in the Floyd family, that if you got too much, someone was going to take it away. That was what they had learned in America. And I think that sets off the course for a lot of reporting that we did and a lot of things that happened in the family's life that people might find a little bit questionable.
I think that's one of the things that makes your book so powerful, is that it's a history of America. It's placing George Floyd in the context of the American dream and the American reality of racism, and it just roots it in a way. And I think in some ways I'm doing the inverse. I am showing you how King emerged to become the greatest American, period, out of that same system of racism, and I couldn't trace his family back beyond 1870. I tried desperately. I was not able to figure out where or by whom his family had been enslaved. But the story of post-1870 just to 1929 when he's born is extraordinary, because King's father, and how many people know that Martin Luther King's name is not Martin Luther King when he was born? All right, maybe some of you have even read the book. It was Mike King, and Mike King Sr. was one of 12 children born into a sharecropping family in Stockbridge, Georgia, on land that is now a Walmart supercenter. And Daddy King, as everybody called him, Martin Luther King Sr., at the age of 12, walked off that farm because he had seen what sharecropping had done to his family, had seen what it did to his father in particular, who was an alcoholic and physically abusive, and decided that he was going to break that cycle. With one pair of shoes tied over his shoulder so he wouldn't wear them out, he started making his way from Stockbridge to Atlanta, 20 miles. And in Atlanta, he reinvents himself and goes back to school, teaches himself to read and write, becomes a preacher, marries into this family of Ebenezer Baptist Church, knowing that it's a good career move, and makes it possible for Martin Luther King to become a Nobel Prize winner and the greatest American, period. And that is because of so much of the sweep of American history, because families like the Kings were leaving the farms, in some cases migrating to the north, in some cases migrating to cities. But Daddy King is an American hero who's deserving of his own books and operas or whatever you want to do to tell that story, because he is making it possible for his son to lead the way and to suggest that America can be a different country. But you have to understand where he comes from to understand just how amazing that is.
He had a bit of temper, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, too. Yeah, Daddy King was violent with his kids and spanked them in public on the front lawn. He would spank his kids. His sister would joke. Martin's sister would joke that that was the first sign that young ML was going to be nonviolent, and that he would not shout, he would not scream when his daddy spanked him. And sometimes Daddy King would make the kids spank each other, and Martin wouldn't do it. He wouldn't spank his siblings. So yeah, it's a fascinating family.
Absolutely. So you both have spoken about fathers and great-grandfathers, but you also write a considerable amount about mothers and women and their lives. Can you talk to us about the power, the influence, the core relationships between King and Floyd and some of the women in their lives?
This is another reason why you need a new biography of someone like King every generation, because the women have been neglected in the previous biographies, and there still has not been a proper biography of Coretta Scott King. And King's mother was painfully shy, never really sat down and told her own story, and I thought it was really important to write a book that came as close as possible to giving Coretta her due. She still needs another book of all her own, and to really celebrating the women in King's life. And I was very lucky to have sort of a panel of advisors on this book, historians, theologians who were reading chapters for me. And one of those theologians said to me, because I originally wrote my first chapter opening with a scene about King's grandfather, and this theologian said to me, have you considered the fact, it was Lewis Baldwin, he said, have you considered the fact that in a way King's grandmother is really the more important spiritual ancestor, because she's the one who did not turn to violence and alcohol, but turned to the Bible. And her strength is really what informs his strength, if you just want to be, more poetic about it. And it was an epiphany to me. And it also just reinforced it was just a helpful reminder that the women need their turn. So I changed that first chapter, and now it begins with his grandmother rather than with his grandfather.
Yeah, I was really nervous about the idea of having a male-centered story, even though we were writing about a man. And I think one of the most important parts about recognizing the power of women in George Floyd's life is George Floyd's testimony when we first meet him. The fact that not only does he say, I can't breathe at least 27 times, but the shouting of his mother. And we really wanted to understand that, why he would do that, what the reporting began to show was that connection between his mother, Sissy, and George Floyd was incredibly strong, that this sort of sense of charity that people who had known George Floyd to have really came from the mother's way of running the home, bringing people in, her kindness, her ability to make good food and distribute it to everybody. But then, and I think that adds to the understanding of why he said the words he said when he was dying, that connection that he made. The other thing that I thought became so clear was after the world first meets George Floyd, it's really the women in Minnesota who are responsible, or who really take the brunt of the work for trying to push the state and more largely the nation into really coming to terms with the roots of the problem. They're the ones who pushed the mayor. They're the ones who pushed the governor, who at that time was Tim Walz. And they're the ones who try to force people to realize what became an incredibly salient thing for me in terms of being motivated to continue this course of reporting, which is that if you believe that the racism that confronted George Floyd on the day that he was murdered was bad, you also have to consider the racism that encountered him when he lived, and also the racism that's encountered by my son, that's encountered by me, that's encountered by everyone, because we're all still living it. Sometimes there's a question about why we didn't end the book with George Floyd's demise. And the truth of the matter is that if we are to consider the fullness of George Floyd's legacy, that it lives very much in the second act of the work, which is about what happens after George Floyd's murders. And even more so, it lives in the third act of the work, which is the lives we all live today and sort of the decisions that we have to make understanding that racism. And that's really powered by the women in the book.
Can I just add, by the way, that it was really the women who started and planned the Montgomery bus boycott. And when they were looking for a leader, because of biases being what they were in the 1950s, they felt like Joanne Robinson couldn't get up there and give that big speech. They had to pick a man. But all throughout the civil rights movement, the women were doing the essential grassroots work. And Coretta Scott King was not just the wife staying home and raising the kids. She was pushing him intellectually and in terms of activism. I think the reason Martin Luther King fell in love with Coretta was that she was a greater activist with more experience than he was at the time of their meeting. So the women, and King had a real problem with this. He did not promote women in the organization. He did not recognize their potential. It was, it's sad to say, he's one of our greatest fighters for equality, but he had a real blind spot when it came to women. But the women did not accept their position as being ignored. They, including his own wife, continued to push and made a huge impact on his career.
Yeah, I really do think that in your book, the relationship, sort of the depiction of Coretta Scott King, almost feeling that her boyfriend wasn't radical enough for her, was one of the most eye-opening parts of it.
Yeah, I love that about it.
So I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions. So get yourselves ready if you have something that you want to ask. These are both such comprehensive biographies or works of nonfiction who address these individuals' lives within their context, their interior lives, the structural and systemic racism which shaped their lives, the relationships with women, with children, with community members, really incredibly comprehensive works. After doing all this research in the work, is there or are there any burning questions that are left for you that you felt like you couldn't get answered? Were there any sources that you felt like that you couldn't get access to that you feel like maybe if they open up in a couple of years, we'll learn something new? Is there someone you weren't able to talk to that you would have loved to have talked to because they would have had great insight? But after having written these incredible works, what questions are you left with about their lives?
I can answer sort of, people ask, if we feel like we had missed anything about George Floyd's character. And I really don't want the answer to be no, but the answer is of course we have in some point. But I think one of the great gifts that George Floyd left was, he was a bit of a writer. And I had heard this rumor that a person that we had been talking to had a plastic bag filled with diary entries and poems, and I was really nervous about asking the person about it because I was worried that if I asked, they'd say no and kick me out. But this person had a bit of a mystical sense to them, and I saw one day there was a magic 8-ball in their house, and I picked up the magic 8-ball, and they asked what I was doing, and I said, I'm debating on and asking you whether or not you should open your closet. The person said, well, let's see what it says. And I shook it, and I turned around, and I didn't look, and it said, absolutely. And then, then all these gaps about, what was George Floyd thinking when he did this or that, they're all he had written it all down, and they offered really great testimonies about him. However, there are a number of people who, I hope the next time in 10 or 15 or 30 years when someone tries to understand his life, I would get a better shot at. For example, if any of you live on the internet, I'm sure you've heard about this sort of unclear, likely untrue story about George Floyd holding a gun to a pregnant woman and robbing her. Well, there are a few things that were wrong in the story. We sort of dismantled a lot of that mythology within the reporting of the book. But along the way, we did hear a couple names of likely suspects, and we tried really hard to see if we could actually get a confession to exonerate George Floyd. And we got pretty close, but the nature of the pandemic made it a little bit hard to get to some of the subjects. And so that's one part that, I really hoped we would be able to get to and sort of put together in a neatly wrapped bow. But we also understood that the public's capacity for wanting to discuss issues of systemic racism was rapidly waning, and that if we had taken much longer, that people might not care at all.
Well, for me, the biggest thing that I wish that I could have found was the blue suitcase. Coretta kept a blue Samsonite suitcase under her bed filled with all the personal letters that Martin had written her over the years, and I was not able. Her secretary told me that, and I was not able to get at those letters. I think the kids have it, and I guess they're never going. I don't know. Maybe someday that those letters will become public, and that will be an occasion for another King biography. But the other thing for me is that there are thousands of FBI documents. It's worth noting and reminding people that the federal government surveilled Martin Luther King, that Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy authorized the FBI to wiretap his phones of his associates, his home and his office, and they also authorized listening devices in his hotel room so they could try to catch him in compromising circumstances, which they did, and that they sent those tapes from some of those exchanges to his home in an attempt to destroy his marriage, and including a letter in that package suggesting to King that the only way out for him was suicide. Our government did that. The same government that honors him with a national holiday today. And there are more tapes to be released. The FBI is set to release the audio of those recordings in 2027. The irony, of course, is that now that we have the transcripts of a lot of those conversations, they help us understand King in a way that the FBI never intended. So I don't mean this to in any way justify what they did, but there's this bitter, ironic silver lining in that we can hear King's phone calls, and we can see how desperate he was, how unhappy he was, how frustrated he was as he felt like the American public was abandoning him, that they were no longer listening to him. And yet he continued. He never gave up. In fact, in the last years of his life, he became more and more vocally radical. I argue that he was radical his whole life. Some people say, the last few years of his life, he began speaking out on northern segregation and systemic racism and economic inequality and war. I say it was there all along. We only began to pay attention to it the last few years. But as the government is clamping down on him, and we can hear him growing more and more frustrated, there's this phone call in 1967, exactly a year before his assassination, where he's just given this, my favorite King speech, Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York, where he basically explains his whole philosophy on why he would be hypocritical to stick to the South, as his friends are urging him to do, why it would be hypocritical to focus only on segregation when the segregation in the North is just as bad, and why it would be hypocritical to speak out only when there's rioting and violence in the streets of America, and not to talk about the fact that the greatest purveyor of violence on earth is the U.S. government in Vietnam, and why he has to do these things because his faith compels him to. And the next day, there's this phone call with one of his best friends who says that was a terrible speech. It's going to hurt us. It's going to set us back in our fundraising. It's going to damage our relationship with the president. And we know exactly what King says because the FBI is recording the call. He says, "My speech may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise." And your heart just breaks that Martin Luther King has to explain himself still at this point in his career. And that's the bitter, ironic gift that the FBI tapes have given us. But what we should remember is not just that King was frustrated, but that he continued, that he never lost hope in what he could accomplish and what this country could do.
Incredible moral leadership against all kinds of political pressure. We can open up for questions from the audience. I believe, is there a microphone that they should use?
Yeah, you can ask your question from the podium here in the center.
Can you come to the center microphone? Thank you.
Hi. I have a kind of controversial question. How frustrating is it to you guys that some people can excuse or ignore George Floyd's death because of his criminal record, but people in high power like Trump, who have an even more extensive record of felonies, can run for presidency and control how we live our lives?
Thank you.
I love this question. One of the true ironies, before the book was about to be released, I was getting a new pair of AirPods so I could do better Zoom interviews, and I was speaking with a person at the Apple store who said to me, well, are you going to talk about all of it? And I was like, what do you mean all of it? And she said how he was a bad person, because maybe we shouldn't talk about like George Floyd. We should only talk about what happened after. And I said, well, everyone just said Black lives mattered or all lives mattered. So his life mattered, right? In some cosmic sense, but also in understanding that there's a larger context to what happened to him and why he did that, and looking at why police did things that he did. It's sort of interesting when you think about George Floyd had one violent crime, right? Which our reporting showed was a tentative identification from a woman who was not pregnant, right? So like when they had to fill out the document, she said, I'm positive, I'm negative, I'm tentative, right? She chose tentative, looking at a photo lineup. She also said that the man who assaulted her was 5'6", George Floyd was 6'6". She also said she wasn't pregnant. And she also spoke Spanish, and there's no documentation that the people who interviewed her did, right? Neither Tolu nor I spoke Spanish, and this was the testimony that she gave, right? And so I think when we consider a person and we consider castigating judgment against them, right, it's important to be able to not do it swiftly, but to truly look at the evidence, right? And to truly understand that given what we know about how grace is given in America, whether or not that person received the apt, true, righteous amount of grace. For George Floyd, I think based on what we know, based on the brilliance he showed as a young child, based on how he tried to further his life, I think you can make a great argument about how he was not given that grace. I think, as a journalist who has covered the former president, I think there's another discussion to be had based on what we know and based on the evidence about the type of grace he's given. And I think you can apply those same principles to both people and do it in a way that's fair.
Thank you for that question. I saw one over here as well. Can you come to the microphone? And then the web, it can share.
So both of you are well-renowned journalists, and I myself am hoping to be a journalist one day. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how a journalist hoping to break into the political landscape could hold some integrity within how our political sphere is looking today.
Well, I would say, first of all, thank you for considering journalism. We need journalism. We haven't figured out really how to fund it these days so well, but the need for journalists has never been greater, and the needs for people who are willing to fight for the truth and to get the truth out there as it becomes more difficult is more important than ever. I think the main thing I would say is read and write everywhere you can and find a way to get your stories told, even if it's harder than ever to get paid for it. If you do good work, you'll find a way to get paid for it. I still like to believe.
Yeah, it took 15 years in my journalism career for me to work at a news organization that was profitable, and that lasted for a handful of time. But I think, in my not book writing life, I've spent the majority of my career writing about lawmakers in this country, considering the impact that they have on people. And I think one is your gut check, right? You have to be sure that the work that you're doing, you can sleep with at night and feel great about waking up in the morning and doing it again. And two, it's like the nature of curiosity just goes so far. I think a lot of the problems that we see in political journalism today have to do with people seeing things online and following what they saw online, as opposed to trying to be able to shape the conversation for people who have to vote. I think there's a few things that are in the country that are as more righteous as helping a public understand what their public officials do and help people to do work that helps people helps people get closer to one another, helps people understand different opinions. This is my 6th time in Jackson, Mississippi. All through the work that I've done and the lessons that I've learned here have been invaluable. So congratulations on being in a good place to get started.
Thank you. Hi. So this question is out of purely selfish reasons. I'm writing a biography, finishing it up. So I was curious, just 2 questions. Like, first, what is for you, if you can talk about the emotional journey in writing these biographies of 2 Black men who were murdered, for you as you're grappling with that while trying to publish. And then the second question comes from working with families, which I found was the joy and beauty of doing oral histories with families. But for you all, do you invite families back in as you're going through the writing process if they choose to read maybe advanced copies of the book, or like just what is the family's reception at the end of the published works as well?
So I can start. The Floyd family is a very large family, as I said. So some participated with us, some opted not to, as is their right. And some of them would want to read every word, and others would not want to read a single word, as is also their right. I think people, I don't think it's a good idea to write books for the people you're writing about. And I think sometimes if you're doing the job correctly, they'll kind of be exhausted with you by the end. The day you say we're done might be the best day of their life or the best day of their week. I think the emotional journey of this was super hard for me. I mean, it started from this great cavity, right? This cavity of not fully understanding why our country is the way it is and not understanding who George Floyd was. And for me, there was a pretty distinct joy in learning about who George Floyd was, because it turned out, thank goodness, that he was the kind of person that if he said, tell me a story about Floyd, people would go, you want to know about Floyd? This one time, and then they just go off, you know? These are the sort of questions that people were not asking them. So there was a particular joy in doing that. And I think it's also true that when we got to really hard parts, I'll tell you, there was one weekend where I had 7 interviews in a row where people had breakdowns in front of me. In one case, one of the people started punching themselves. It was really hard. And I had said to Toluse, if I'm being honest, why are we even doing this? We should probably just end and quit, like, well, we're ahead. And Toluse was, he didn't tell me this at the time, but Toluse was about to have a son, a black boy. My partner and I, we had just had a miscarriage. My editor had just had a baby. And Toluse looked at me and goes, you know, Robert, we just got to do our part. We got to do our part. And for me, what he meant and what I understood was that we needed to use the tools that were given to us to make sure that we were creating a society that was better for his kid and my editor's kid and my friends' kids and hopefully one day mine. And I think knowing that and knowing that you'd be able to produce a work that would have resonance, that lived beyond the moment, but could help explain the moment to people who hadn't lived through that moment, is such a tremendous gift. And so I hope as you go through everything, that's the thing to keep in mind, the gift of legacy that you're providing for people who'll read the work.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I would just add, you know, that if you're going to do this, if you're going to spend the years that it takes to write a book, 6 years in my case for this one, you have to be doing, you're certainly not doing it for the money. You're doing it because you believe in something important that you can contribute, that you can help create empathy, that you can help someone understand another human being, that you can help someone better understand the world, the country in which we're living. And if that's not an emotional journey for you, then you're probably doing it wrong. And if you're engaged with the families who lived through this, and you're not changed by that in some way, you're probably doing it wrong. And for me, I'm living through this era that you're writing about so vividly as I'm writing this book, and I'm writing about this moment of great hope on August 28th, 1963, when King gives his most famous speech. And I'm writing about the next day, August 29th, 1963, when the FBI produces a memo saying, given the March on Washington, given King's speech, given King's dream, we must now rate him, if we have not already done so, as the most dangerous man in America when it comes to race. If you're not feeling that, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. Thank you for those powerful questions. I think we need to wrap up at this point. I just want to thank you both for the gift that you gave us today in terms of everything that you shared about the craft of writing, about the lives of the two people that you focused on. You also, I just want to bring it to an end here, that you both end your books with a level of hope and spirituality. The final word in your book is Amen. The final phrase in your book is a lyric from the old Negro spiritual, we shall overcome someday. And so through the difficulty of the stories that you told, which are all so intimately linked to the Black freedom struggle, which is unfinished, you leave us with hope, right? You leave us with a path forward and an ability to continue doing work as our audience members are doing to build a better world. So thank you for everybody who came out here today. Thank you to the two of you for your years of commitment and emotional work and just skill that helped us to understand the lives of these two men. Thank you.